it's been a while since we met. So the last thing we were looking at, we talked about the 3 trials before the Jews, and then we started with the trials before Rome, and we talked about Jesus' first appearance before Pilate and how that trial went. He has 3 trials before the Jews, and he's going to have 3 trials before the Romans. He's going to see Pilate, then Herod, and then back to Pilate, okay? And then we talked quite a bit about this stuff. We talked about the fact that the reason the Jews took him to Pilate is for a couple of reasons. The primary reason is because Jesus said he would be crucified. If the Jews were going to kill Jesus, it would be by stoning. So it has to be the Romans who are going to actually be the executioners in order for that prophecy to come true, okay? So bottom line, the reason behind it is that. That is the reason behind it. Secondly, the Jews, the reason they're taking him before Pilate and before Rome is because they need some way of washing their hands of it in order to appease the people who have been, saying that Jesus is, the triumphal entry and all of that, and saying he's king of the Jews. So they want something to distance themselves from having any guilt in the murder of Jesus. So that's their thinking behind it. But the real reason we talked about and we know is that God had planned it, and Jesus had said, I will be lifted up. So therefore, it has to happen that way. We saw a lot of conversation back and forth between Jesus and Pilate, and I think we ended up with the one where he was talking about truth, and Jesus tells him his kingdom's not of this world. If he's like, I can't believe you're not defending yourself. Can't you hear the things that they're saying about you? And he says, are you really a king? And why was it that the Jews are saying he's a king? Why did they come up with that? Why did they have to come up with that? Because the Jews know that Rome could care less about any kind of a religious squabble among the Jews. As far as the Romans are concerned, every religion is fine. The more religions, the merrier. And they are not going to get involved in anybody's local fusses about any religion or anybody who's broken any laws of the religion. And that's why he tells the Jews, take him yourselves and deal with him. You have my permission, go stone him. You can kill him. They gave the right of capital punishment back to him. They said Pilate's feeling was, I can't be bothered with a religious dispute. Rome could care less about that. All gods were fine as far as they were concerned. But the Jews, again, that's when they basically say, no, we can't do that. We have to, we're not allowed. I think we ended kind of on that, where the Jews were saying, we don't have the right to kill. We don't have the right to murder. That's you guys. You have to do that, and we know that the Jews are never, ever, ever guilty of wanting to keep Rome's laws. And I think that's kind of where we were finished up last week. So where I want to go this week at the beginning here, because I'm not sure what we overlapped. So let's go to Luke 23. Luke 23. Let's go there. In Luke 23, starting in verse 1, that should say like 1 through 6, I think, or 1 through 7. It says, then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. Now this is Luke's account. They arose from the Sanhedrin and they're dragging him to Pilate, okay? And he says, they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the king. We might have talked about this too, I'm not sure. That's a new charge. Why are the Jews upset? What are they saying in the Sanhedrin? What was their charges against Jesus under the 3 trials in front of the Jews? What did they say? Said he's guilty of blasphemy. He claims to be the Son of God. Therefore, we don't need any more trial. We don't need any more legalities. Let's just execute him. We need to kill him. But that's not what they're saying here. And the reason is they understand the process. They understand and know that they have to have something besides a religious charge against him, or Pilate will not listen to them at all. And so they come up with this on the fly. You know, we're marching him to Pilate. We better have a charge to take to him. So it can't be that he claims to be the king, that he claims to be the Son of God. You know, that's not going to matter to them, or so they think. So he says, we found this fellow perverting the nation. The nation is Rome, okay? Forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. Now, we know that's not true, because we have the story where Jesus provides coinage out of a fish's mouth for Peter to go pay taxes for both of them. He's just finished that week in the temple area telling the people, render to Caesar what's Caesar's, go pay your taxes. You don't, and render to God's what's God's. So we know that that's not true. He's not been teaching that. It's an out and outright lie. And so here that he's perverting our nation. Okay, he's a threat to Rome. That's what that means. He's a threat to Rome. He's forbidding Jews to pay taxes to Caesar. That's a capital offense. Okay, and he says he himself is Christ, a king, and that's a capital offense. You can't threaten Caesar. All right. So now they know that will get Pilate's attention. Then Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "It is as you say." So Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." Now, last time we looked at a long, big conversation before we got to that point. Luke doesn't include all of that, okay? But when Pilate says to the chief priests and the crowd, notice how Luke separates that, the chief priest and the crowd. There's two factions here. There are undoubtedly people in this group that do not want to see Jesus crucified. And I don't think we ever really think about that so much. When we look at this tonight, we're going to see over and over and over who it is who's leading the charge against Jesus, who's stirring up the crowd, who's leading the chant, okay? And so Luke makes it clear that there's two groups of people here. There's the common people, and then there's the chief priest. And we know from previous things we've seen in Scripture that the people are afraid to go against the chief priest. Remember all that? Remember when the blind man got his sight, and they want to know, they drag him before the Sanhedrin, who healed you? And he said, well, I don't know who he was. All I know is I was blind, now I see. They drag his parents in. His parents go, oh, he's of age. You talk to him, leave us out of it. And then Scripture says it's because they were afraid of being kicked out of the synagogue. So the people are afraid to go against what the chief priests say and do, especially if there's not a huge crowd to back them. This is 5 o'clock in the morning, okay? Yeah, it's during Passover, but that's still early by anybody's reckoning, okay? So there's probably not as many of the crowd, especially at the beginning of this interaction with Pilate. I'm sure it continues to grow. When he says, I find no fault in this man, what do you think that means? What do you think it means? What? Could be, I don't care. It's not that. It's legal. It's not that. It's not that Pilate personally says, well, I don't think he's done anything. What is it? When you're in a court of law and somebody says, I find, and it's the judge who's saying that, what is that? No. Well, that's the reason he couldn't find any fault. There wasn't enough evidence. Yeah, exactly. But what is that? What's he doing? He's a judge, and he says, I find. That's the verdict, right? Yeah, that's the verdict. He has just pronounced Jesus innocent. He's the judge. He's had all this long conversation with him, and he finds him innocent. And that creates an uproar. Look what it says next. But they were the more fierce, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. Now, that's not one person saying that. There's the chief priests are just rabble-rousing, getting the people, and they're volatile, very, very volatile. We know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the way that they chucked all of their own Jewish laws and rules about court out the window. They have one agenda. They want this man dead. Okay? And they are rabid in their hatred for him and in their desire to see him executed. And when Pilate pronounces his findings, his verdict as innocent, they won't allow it. They're not going to leave. He can't turn Jesus loose, and they're not going anywhere. They're continuing to all the more fierce, okay? They've already been loud. We know that. They've already been screaming. And so they do not like his verdict, all right? He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. And that's music to Pilate's ears, because he hears the word Galilee. And he says, I know what I can do. I got to get off this hot seat, you know. He cannot, we talked a lot about Pilate and his history with the Jews, I think the last time we were in here, didn't we? Talked about all of the things he did with putting Caesar's picture on these flags and marching them into town, and it caused a riot, and then he put them on shields. Did we talk about that? Okay, all right, everybody looks blank, and I'm like, oh, maybe I dreamed that. I know, it has been. We've been out almost, 3 weeks, a month? Close, yeah. He's already been reported, to Caesar more than once. He's already been brought back to Rome more than once, threatening, you're going to have no job. You're going, this isn't going to work. So when they're all the more fierce and they're screaming at him and they're getting louder and louder and things are getting out of control, he can't just turn Jesus over to these people. He can't free him, because then they're going to go to Caesar again. He can't afford that. So when he hears Galilee, it gives him an idea. It says, when Pilate heard Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. He's sharp, okay? And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Okay? So he doesn't have to send him back to Galilee. It's really probably down one street and around the corner to where Herod's palace is that he comes to when there's a Passover. Okay? It's very close to the temple. We are at the Praetorium, which is in Fort Antonia, which is right behind the temple. So it's very, very close. And he hears that Jesus is a Galilean. He says, I don't have to make the decision on this. I can pass it off to Herod. Herod, we talked about, I think, he's one of Herod the Great's sons. What else do you know about him? You tell me. What else do you know about him? This is Herod who? Which Herod, do you know? Antipas. Herod Antipas. What else do you know about him? Anything? Yes, he's the one who executed John the Baptist. Okay? Why? He didn't like what John the Baptist preached about adultery, since he was in an adulterous relationship, and he didn't want to hear anything that Jesus had to say, or that John the Baptist had to say. In fact, he's rejected everything that John the Baptist had to say, and he had a great opportunity, all right? So Jesus, because he's from Galilee, he can pass him off to Herod, so he sends him over to Herod. It says Herod was in Jerusalem also at that time. Now, at this point, Pilate has decreed that Jesus is innocent multiple times. And Pilate knows Jesus is innocent. And Pilate, as a judge of Rome, his highest job description is to do justice. And it's important. The Romans are real big on that, okay? Pilate's asked them for charges. They don't give him any. They basically say, when he says, what are the charges? They say, we wouldn't have brought him to you if he wasn't a criminal. In other words, we don't want you to do a trial. We want you to execute. We don't need you to be a judge today. We need you to be an executioner. And they don't even give any charges until he pronounces innocent, and then they bring up this thing about, he's perverting the nation. He won't tell people not to pay their taxes, and he claims to be a king. Well, that's a horse of another color, okay? So he's sending him to Herod, to have Herod judge that. So let's look at Luke 23, 6 through 12. It says, now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him. Now, if you go back to Luke chapter 13, Jesus gets warned by some of his disciples, not necessarily one of the 12, but some of his followers warn Jesus, saying, you got to get out of here. Herod wants to kill you, okay? So we know that Herod is no fan of Jesus. But here, it doesn't seem like he's out to kill Jesus, partly because he can't. Why? No, that's not the reason. He's not in Galilee. He's in Jerusalem. Herod has no jurisdiction here. Pilate hands him off to Herod, saying, hey, he's your problem. Herod goes, I can't do anything. I'm not in Galilee. We're in Jerusalem. Pilate, that's your jurisdiction. Herod has no power in Jerusalem at all. His other brother, his other Herod, is over Jerusalem. He's not. Okay, so he can't do anything. So, but his interest here seems to just be curiosity. You know, he had desired for a long time to see him because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. So he's looking for a show. You know, he wants to see what all is the hoopla about. You know, and he's heard lots of things about him. Well, he's heard about him raising Lazarus from the dead, obviously. Herod is Jewish, so he hears all of this stuff. He's from Galilee, where Jesus did most of his ministry, so he's heard lots about that. In fact, he's threatened by Jesus to the point he wants to kill him because he believes that once he killed John the Baptist, Jesus doing miracles is John the Baptist reincarnated. All right? But he thinks he's pretty safe here because he doesn't have any jurisdiction. He's not going to kill him, but he wants to see what's going on. Lazarus has just been raised from the dead. We've just had the triumphal entry. We've just seen Jesus stand his own with 4 or 5 different groups of people trying to trap him, giving answers like nobody's ever heard before. And so Herod's like, great, you're coming to see me? Maybe I'll get to see a miracle. Maybe I'll have. So he questions him, notice what it says, with many words. He goes on and on and on, questioning Jesus over and over and over, asking him one thing then another. Now remember, what does Jesus look like at this point? Get that picture in your head. He's what? Beat up. Yeah, beat up. He's been up all night. He's been beaten. He's been slapped around. He's bloodied. He looks miserable. He does not look like a powerful king. He doesn't look like a powerful prophet. He doesn't look like a powerful anything. He looks pitiful. So he keeps questioning him, and it says he answered him nothing. Now, this is the only person out of all of this stuff that goes on that Jesus refuses to talk to. Why do you think that is? Well, he killed John the Baptist, right? And he had lots of opportunity under John the Baptist for salvation. If you remember, while John the Baptist was in his prison, it said that Herod went to him multiple times and talked with him. Now, you know John the Baptist was preaching the gospel to him, right? That was what he preached everywhere. And you know that Herod has had more than one opportunity to accept Christ, to accept the Messiah, to repent, and he never does any of that. Herod has basically self-condemned himself. There's nothing Jesus is going to say that's going to change his mind. And so Jesus wants nothing to do with him. It's really kind of a sad picture when you think about it. But when you look at Herod, you know that he's done it to himself. All right? So Jesus answers him nothing. And then notice what happens next, or what's going on. While Herod is questioning him with all this, the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Now, who are these guys? Who are the chief priests and the scribes? Yeah, they're the Sanhedrin, right? Now, where were they just a few minutes ago? The Pilate's palace, right? In the Praetorium. So they have followed. Jesus has been taken under guard, and they have followed, accusing him the entire time, and they're vehemently accusing him in front of Herod. They want this man dead. And notice, Luke makes no distinction here. The chief priests and the scribes, he doesn't mention the crowd. But he says it's the chief priests and the scribes who are vehemently, at the top of their lungs, accusing Jesus. All right? All the things they can think of to accuse him, to try to get Herod to do something. But Herod thinks it's kind of a joke. He thinks it's a mockery. It says, then Herod with his men of war, who are they? Who do you think? Huh? His bodyguards, yeah. His soldiers, yes. Herod is called a king, but he's really more like a mayor on steroids, not quite a governor, okay? a small town guy, but a bully, and protects himself at all costs, and he has his own little army, okay? And so it says Herod with his men of war, so his thugs, if you want to look at it that way. I mean, these aren't weaklings, and he didn't hire these guys because, you know, they could speak well. He hired them because they're muscle, right? These are his thugs. With his men of war, then Herod with his men of war, so with them, Herod included with his bodyguards, they treat Jesus with contempt, mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, sent him back to Pilate. Now, in between all this that's been happening with Pilate, we know that Jesus has a robe thrown on him. I think Matthew says it's red, Mark says it's purple, or vice versa, or whatever. It's probably a purple robe that has faded out to red. It's a military robe that soldiers, a high-ranking soldier's robe, probably an old one that they use in this King's game. We'll talk about it a little bit. This is not the same robe, and it's not even the same kind of robe. This robe was a king's robe, a Jewish king's robe. It was always white, okay? And most often, they interwove it with silver threads so that it glistened, okay? Because the king, a Jewish king, was God's chosen, like David, the line of David. Well, Herod's not of the line of David, but, you know, he's got his father's ego, so white robes with silver threads suit him just fine. So we see that Jesus has suffered mockery under a military robe, and now he's suffering mockery under a king's robe. You know, and when you think about it, doesn't Jesus in the Bible fulfill those roles? Prophet, priest, king. He is head of the heavenly host. He's the commander-in-chief of the angelic army, right? So they're making a mockery of him, just like when the Sanhedrin accused him of blasphemy as a crime, but it's not blasphemy if it's true. And mocking him with a military robe when he is the commander of the heavenly armies, or mocking him with a king's robe when he is the King of Kings. You know, it just shows how evil, intended, and how foolish these people are. You know, they are mocking God himself. So he thinks it's a joke. He arrays him this gorgeous robe, and he sends him back to Pilate. Basically, Herod's going, nothing I can do. Besides that, I don't think he's a king. He's no threat. He's this pitiful-looking guy, and I can even mock him, okay? Now, Herod's supposed to be half Jewish, right? And he's supposed to be the Jewish representative. So he should know about Messiah and all that. So if he believes for an instant that Jesus is King of the Jews, would he be doing this? Obviously, he doesn't at all, okay? It says, that very day, Pilate and Herod became friends. Now, why would they not be friends before? What do you think? Herod's Jewish, Pilate's Roman, right? Pilate is a Greek. He is, you know, all these gods. Herod pretends to be fully Jewish, but he's really not, right? He's an Edomite, actually. So they're political enemies, okay? But it says, that very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. Political enemies. Why are they now friends? Because they now have a common enemy. And what have they both done? Both seeing that Jesus gets mocked. All right? Okay. All right, so now back to, that's all we have on his trial before Pilate. Luke's the only one who talks about, before Herod. Pilate's the only one golly, I'm having a hard time with names. Luke is the only one who tells us anything about Jesus being before Herod, okay? That's what I mean to say. All right, so now he has to go back before Pilate for the second part of the trial. Poor Pilate. He's trying every way in the world not to execute a man that he knows is innocent. He could be in just as much trouble with Rome for doing that as he could be if these Jews decide to riot again. So he's really kind of between a rock and a hard place. He's just not very brave. All right, so Matthew, we'll look at Matthew first, and then we'll go on to the others. And remind yourself that each one of them is Each one of them is seeing this from a different viewpoint, and each one of them emphasizes different aspects, and we're going to get a little bit of information and a lot of repetition, okay, as we look at all three of these. It says, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. This is not a Roman tradition. This was Pilate's tradition. Why? Because he needs to do things to get in good with these Jewish people who are trying to get him out of office. So it says during the feast. Now we're talking about Passover. Passover, this 8-day festival. During that 8-day festival, the governor, that's Pilate, okay, was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And so Pilate thinks, okay, here's an opportunity. I can circumvent executing this guy by releasing this guy. He says, now at that time they had a notorious, Matthew calls him a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. Pilate's no political fool. He understands that they want Jesus dead because they're jealous. He understands that this guy is not a threat to Rome, but he is a threat to the Jews' power. And he knows that so he's hoping that the crowd aspect, that the people here in this crowd will have enough common sense to know that you don't want Barabbas released, okay? When we look in, on the other ones, Barabbas gets called different things. He gets called a robber. He gets called in the Greek, it's a term, a bandit, which in the Old English, it's a brigand, okay? So we're not talking about a petty thief here. We're going to look in Luke, and in Luke 23 and Mark 15, he gets called a murderer, okay? And he also gets called an insurrectionist. So he's been present in a rebellion. He has killed people. He's murdered people. And so he's not the kind of person that anybody in their right mind would want to let out of jail, okay? We've seen a lot of that recently, right? Yeah. He's not the kind of person you want walking around free. So he's not a petty thief. He's not someone simple. He is a notorious man of violence, gross violence, okay? Looking at his name, it's interesting. A lot of word plays have been done on his name trying to figure out what it really means, but very simply, it's two words. B-A-R means son of. Abba means daddy. Son of man, son of daddy. Isn't that amazing that you have this criminal who is a human, son of dad is his name. And then here you have the true Son of Man standing next to him, who is the holy, the perfect, the heavenly Son of Man. And it's, when you think about it, for Jesus to have to stand there before them as though he is a criminal on the same equal level as this Barabbas, that's just more mockery. You know, it's more insulting, I guess. What else want to tell you about him? We'll get to some more descriptions of him in a second, all right? It says, while he was sitting in the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. Matthew's the only one that records this. While Pilate is sitting there in the judgment seat, and Jesus and Barabbas are being presented to the people, Pilate's wife comes and interrupts him, which isn't usually done, okay, in Middle Eastern culture. And she has a warning for him. She says, I have suffered all night long with nightmares that this guy is just, meaning that man's innocent. I know it from a dream, have nothing to do with him. It won't go well with you if you do. Why is that in here? One of the commentators said, basically, this is God giving the Jews a chance, an opportunity to convince the crowd that they want to turn loose a murderer. That's not something that people would probably automatically want to do instantaneously, and they might take a moment. So there's an interruption in the court. Pilate has to deal with his wife. We don't know how long that took. We don't know what all they said, okay? But Matthew records that. And when he comes back, it says, but the chief priest and elders, notice who they are, persuaded the multitudes. Who are they? They're the crowd. The crowd must have needed persuading, right? Who wants Barabbas in your backyard walking around free? But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Wow, sounds crazy. The governor, that's Pilate, answered and said to them, which of the two do you want me to release to you? Thinking he knows the answer. It will be Jesus. Might have been if that had happened immediately, but now we've had this opportunity, this time and frame in here for these chief priests and the elders to rile up the crowd and convince them that of the two horrible, horrible criminals standing before them, Jesus is the more dangerous. They're must be pretty convincing. Pilate said to them, what then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? And he makes a comparison. Barabbas, who's called murderer, insurrectionist, bandit, against Jesus who is called Christ. Your word for him, by the way, he's making the claim. Your word for Christ is the Messiah, the anointed one by your God, who's supposed to be your king. So, Pilate's done his homework. I mean, he knows about this. It's hard not to know about who Jesus is at this point in time. And he's pointing that out to him. And they all said to him, let him be crucified. What did they want done with him? If you want Barabbas released, I still got this Jesus on my hand. What do you want me to do? Turn him loose? No, crucify him. Crucify him. Then the governor said, why? What evil has he done? You can hear it that he's like, this isn't justice. This isn't right. But they cried out all the more, saying, let him be crucified. Notice the they. Notice it says up here, Pilate said, what should we do? And it says, they all said. So the priests and the elders were pretty effective in persuading them that Barabbas was the better choice to be let go. And they all said, crucify him. And they all cried out all the more, let him be crucified. So what do you have going on right now? Mob mentality. Mob mentality is when people park their brains at the door and don't really rationally analyze things. They just go along with the adrenaline and the excitement of the moment and what's happening. People who participate in mob mentality often afterwards are like, who was that person? I can't believe I did all that. Because it is as strong as addictions. It will lower your inhibition threshold. Everybody has a level where I won't do anything below this line, okay? But there are certain things that will drop you below your inhibition threshold. Drugs, alcohol, anesthetic agents, hypnosis, and mob mentality. Those are the 5 things that will make you do things you never thought you would do before. You people who go into surgery say some of the dangest things, Yeah. You'd never say that in public. People who are drunk dance on tables naked. They'd never do that if they were sober. Mob mentality is the same way. And that's what we got going on now. It's not logical. It makes no sense. If you polled them one by one and they were all separate from one another, they'd never agree to this. But now they're under the influence of the evil of the chief priests, scribes, Pharisees, who are whipping this crowd into a frenzy. All right. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, what is that? This mob is disintegrating into a riot. There's a riot. A tumult was rising. There's a riot. He took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I want to go on record. Everybody here needs to hear this. I'm going on record. I am innocent of this man's blood. I am innocent of the blood of this just person, this innocent man. You see to it. I want nothing to do with it. And all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. Yeah. Yeah. They're saying, let the guilt fall on us. You don't take any responsibility, Pilate. We'll take full responsibility for this man's death. And not only us, we'll even damn our children in the process. We'll make them responsible for this man's death. Mob mentality. Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Now, the word scourged means to be beaten with a whip. The Roman whip was a short-handled whip, but it had multiple pieces of leather on the end, and on the end of each of those pieces of leather, there were tied pieces of sharpened rock, glass, bone, pottery, and, soldiers don't have a lot to do between executions, so they whittle those things off as sharp as they can. Now, the Jews have a law in Scripture that no one could be punished with 40 lashes. 40 was the maximum. So the Jews, in their wisdom, had passed a law saying no more than 39. That way, we don't want anybody, if somebody miscounted, we don't want to accidentally sin by giving somebody too many. So 39 was the maximum lashes that a Jew could inflict on another Jewish person. All right? The Romans have no such rule. All right? So scourging could only take place on people who were to be executed. Okay? People who were guilty of a capital crime. The reason? Most people didn't live through the scourging. Okay? I have a picture here. This you can still see in Jerusalem today. It is in the Praetorium. It is it's carved into the floor, and this is called the King's Game. And you rolled dice, whatever they use for dice, rocks, bones, whatever. These soldiers played this King's Game only with prisoners who were condemned to death. Okay, and there were different things on here meant different things. I don't read Latin, so of what you could, when you rolled your stone or whatever, what you were allowed to do to the prisoner. Okay, the winner of the game was the soldier who could disembowel a prisoner with the whip without killing them. That was the game. If you killed them, you lost, but if you could disembowel them, you won. So, thinking about, when you hear the word scourged, sounds bad, but it's horrific. It is horrific. And so, part of this game was, because it was, what was the most common reason that you got executed in Rome? Not for murder, by the way. Insurrection, right? Claiming that you were going to overthrow Rome and you're going to be the next Caesar, you're going to be the next king, you're going to boot Rome out. So that's the reason this is called the King's Game, because the people who were subject to this were being executed for being a threat to Rome. So this is where you get the crown of thorns. This is where you get the robe put on. This is where you get a scepter that's nothing more than a reed, and then they beat him over the head with it. Okay? And that's why this is all called the King's Game. So that's what the scourging is. Scourging took place before crucifixion. If you lived through the scourging, then you got crucified. Very bad day, right? Yeah, I know. All right, where are we at? I think we're ready for Mark. Am I right? Okay. It says, now at the feast, he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they requested, and there was one named Barabbas, who was chained with his fellow rebels. Now, there's an interesting point that we didn't have before. Barabbas is not alone. He is chained with his fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion, okay? Now, we're not given a whole lot of information about this, but in some insurrection, some rebellion, these guys were guilty of killing people, murdering people. They could be zealots who were trying to overthrow Rome, part of those bands of people, and they were pretty much lunatics, by the way. Or they could have been part of these robber bands between Jericho and Jerusalem, the very, very dangerous road that you had to travel in groups because you would be murdered if you weren't. They could have been part of that. We don't know. All we know is that they are murderers, and during some rebellion, they were caught because they had murdered people, and they are here together. Most scholars believe that Barabbas was chained to the two men who were crucified on either side of Jesus, okay? He's one of the three, probably the ringleader. That's why Pilate chose him. He's the worst because he's the ringleader, to offer him in place of Jesus, knowing that anybody in their right mind would choose Jesus. But they're not in their right mind, and they don't. So when we think about that, what's the significance of that? Barabbas goes free, and the cross that was prepared for him is most likely the cross that Jesus is put on. And he is between his fellow rebels, Barabbas' fellow rebels. I can't think of a better image of substitutionary death for sinners than that. You know? What do you think about that? Think that's far-fetched or not? I know. That's what the commentator said, so. But it makes sense when you look at this. He's chained with his fellow rebels, and they'd committed murder. So they've already been sentenced to be executed. It says, then the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. They want Pilate to do what he's always done. We have the one version saying Pilate said, do you want me to? And here he says that, do you want me to release the king of the Jews? But it's the people who instigate that, remind him, release somebody to us. Pilate answered, and that's because the scribes and the Pharisees are encouraging the people to ask for that. Right? Pilate answered them saying, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. We saw that in Matthew. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd so that he should rather release Barabbas to them. Pilate answered and said to them again, what then do you want me to do with him who you call the king of the Jews? So they cried out again, crucify him. Pilate said to them, why, what evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, here we get some more information, wanting to gratify the crowd. He's a coward. He's a coward. He wants to make peace with this rowdy crowd. He could have called in all of his soldiers, right? He could have, he's got how many? Because during the festival, they had a whole cohort, 6,000. He could have called them all in, but he didn't. Because if he does that and they slaughter these chief priests and scribes, well, Caesar's not going to put up with that. Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had him scourged to be crucified. All right, to Luke. Where are we at? Okay. Luke gives us some more information. Now, Luke is going back here, and we're at the place where these guys are saying crucify, but we're backwards here a little bit in time. It says, then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, you have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people, and indeed, having examined him in your presence. There's twice that Pilate goes back and talks to Jesus. He said, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. He comes out and he gives, my verdict is he's innocent. They said, but he's trying to go against Rome. He goes back again. He says, are you a king? And Jesus says, well, you say I am. And they have this big, long conversation. He goes, I have examined him again in your presence, and again I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him. That's interesting. He said, I sent you back to him. Pilate sent the whole crowd. Go to Herod. Take your problem to Herod. I sent you back to Herod, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. He says, not just my verdict, Herod's verdict too is this man hasn't done anything. So this is the second go-round. He said, I will therefore chastise him and release him. His goal is, all right, I will have him whipped, I'll have him punished, and then I'll release him. He says, for it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast. So this is his idea. He'll punish this guy. He'll look so pitiful in front of these guys that their humanity will kick in instead of their mob rule. They'll see that this guy is no threat to them or to Rome, and they'll agree to let him be released. But they're not having it. They all cried out at once, saying, away with this man and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder. Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them, but they shouted, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Then he said to them the third time, why? What evil has he done? In other words, he's saying over and over, bring me charges. I don't have any. What's he done? Well, in fact, that's what he wants to know from Jesus. Are you listening to you? What are they saying of you? What are the charges? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. The third time, he's telling them, no, this is what I'm going to do. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priest prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested, and he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. Wow. Wow. Okay, I think we have a little time to do a little bit of John. John starts it in chapter 18 at verse 39, and it starts here at the point where he's talking about releasing Barabbas again. You have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Then they all cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. And it says, now Barabbas was a robber. And that word, what we think of as a robber and what John was writing as a robber in that day, we just talked about. He's not a petty thief. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. John is the one that gives us the details about the king's game, okay? They put on him a purple robe. Then they said, Hail, King of the Jews. And they struck him with their hands. And you know what that means, right? They're pummeling them, they're beating him. These soldiers are, their training has been in executing people, right? Their training has been in torture. They are a professional death squad soldiers, right? So these guys enjoy what they're doing, and they're letting him have it. Pilate then went out again and said to them, Behold, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, Behold the man. Take a good look. Take a good look. This is the guy that you think is a threat. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, instead of having an ounce of pity in a man who's just been beaten to a pulp, who had already been slapped around and beaten up, right? Scripture tells us his face was unrecognizable. I'm sure it was when they got done with him. No pity on their part. They cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. Pilate tries here. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Now, Son of God means two different things to the Jews and then to Pilate. It's totally different. The Jews understand Son of God is a claim to being God himself, a claim to being the Messiah. To the Romans, anyone who was a son of God was one of the gods. And the Romans were very superstitious about dealing with anybody who might be incognito as one of the gods. And so when they say he's claiming to be the Son of God, in Pilate's mind, that's one of these Roman gods in the flesh. And it says, therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. He's not afraid because he believes Jesus is the son of Jehovah God. Probably knows nothing about him. He's superstitiously afraid that he has had beaten one of the sons of the gods and things will not go well for him. By the way, Pilate commits suicide. He ends his own life later on, once he gets thrown back to Rome. Just to throw that out. When Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid and went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, where are you from? He needs to know. But Jesus gave him no answer. You know, he's asked him, what are they saying about you? Are you really a king? If you're a king, where's your army? All those things. But when he asked Jesus where he's from, Jesus doesn't even answer him. Pilate's worried that he is one of the gods. Then Pilate said to him, are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and the power to release you? He goes, do you know who you're dealing with here? You know, you're not going to talk to me? Jesus answered, you could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Ooh, who's he talking about? The Sanhedrin. Not just Judas. Judas, yes, but definitely the Sanhedrin too. Okay? From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. Like, Pilate, don't you know your own laws? And now they're threatening him again with what? You're no friend of Caesar? We're going to tell on you? We're going to tell Caesar? When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in the place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. This has been going on all morning, okay? But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priest answered, we have no king but Caesar. Remember why Israel got booted out of the land? Because they were going after other gods. You remember when they demanded a king under Samuel and they chose Saul, and Samuel was so upset, and God said, look, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. I'm supposed to be their king. They're rejecting me. What did they just do here? We have no king but a pagan Roman. Wow. Then he delivered him to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away. Okay. That's just an extra slide I had for writing my verses. Okay. I have this whole list of verses I want us to look up, but we don't have time to get through them. So this is the basis. Next week we'll start with this. There's huge arguments all the time over who's responsible for the death of Jesus. Is it the Romans? Is it the Jews? Is it God? Who is it? And this has been a debate that's been going on for thousands of years, okay? And so next week we're going to look at the verses that, what the Bible says about that, and it's clear as mud who's responsible. So we'll start there next week. Clear as mud. No, actually, it's clear as day.